When we talk about the female reproductive system, you'll find that there are a lot of things that kind of mirror their counterparts in the male system. So the basic functions of the female system would be to produce the female sex cells, so the oocytes, to produce the female sex hormones. It is also where fertilization and implantation of the zygote is going to happen. It is a good environment for the development, for fetal development. It is also structured that in a way to transport the offspring to the outside of the body. The primary female organ are the ovaries, while the accessory female sex organs are everything else, where basically there's some of them are inside of the body, those are internal organs, and there are also external reproductive organs. Now here you can see the different organs of the female reproductive system, where you can see the ovaries. This is on one side. You can also see the uterine tube or the fallopian tube that connects to the uterus. You see the uterus is above or superior to the urinary bladder and anterior to the rectum. The exit or the lower part of the uterus is known as the cervix. That is found in the upper part of the vagina. And the vagina is behind or posterior to the bladder and posterior to the urethra. And there is the vaginal orifice, and you can also see the labia majora and the labia minora. Now the ovaries are these oval structures that are found on the inside of the pelvis. They're in the pelvic cavity. They are actually right on the wall of the pelvic bone. So they have to have ligaments in order to suspend the ovaries. And we'll take a look at these different ligaments in this image. So again, this is where the pelvic cavity is. These are the pelvic bones. And you can see the ovaries that are pretty much over on the pelvic inlet or the inlet of the pelvic cavity. One of the bigger ligaments that are there is known as the broad ligament of the ovary, and that attaches the ovary and the uterine tube to the pelvic bone. And in order to see the other ligaments, we're going to reflect the uterine tube a little bit. Here you can see the suspensory ligament of the ovary, and just as the name indicates, it suspends the ovary from the pelvic bone. And there is another ligament known as the ovarian ligament, and that connects the ovaries to the uterus. Now the descent of the ovary. So just like we talked about the descent of the testis, the ovary undergo the same process. So the ovaries, again, were these bunch of undifferentiated cells that were found by the kidneys behind the peritoneal cavity. And they develop into ovaries, and then they have to descend into their location found again at the pelvic brim. So they don't descend outside of the pelvic cavity like the testicular tissue would have to do. As for the structure of the ovary, it is made out of medulla. The medulla has connective tissue. It has the blood vessels, lymphatics, and nervous tissue, while the shell, the outer shell, or the cortex is where all of the action is happening, and that's where all of the oocytes are being made and the maturation process of these follicles occur. Now the process of oogenesis actually starts during prenatal development, and I have it kind of like highlighted there to make sure that it gets your attention. Okay, so the process of oogenesis, again, does not start at puberty like it does in males. It rather starts in the prenatal development. So the oogonia, which are these very primitive kind of cells, oogonia again are going to make oocytes or going to make ovum, those start to undergo mitotic division, so they're going to produce more copies of themselves. And then these oogonia are going to mature into what are known as primary oocytes. These primary oocytes are going to be surrounded by follicular cells. Now, that primary oocyte surrounded by follicular cells is called a primordial follicle. So again, this happens during fetal development. This primordial follicle that contains the primary oocyte will even start the first meiotic division. All of this during fetal development. So this is all occurring in a female fetus while she's still in her mom's womb. The process, though, does not complete. So the first meiotic division does not complete. It stops, okay, and it remains halted, it remains stopped until puberty hits. So when that baby girl is born, she is born with primary oocytes that are stopped in their first meiotic division. Now, after delivery, these primordial follicles remain through life, but from delivery up until puberty, there's a process where the primary oocytes that have any genetic abnormalities, they tend to self-destruct. So these number of oocytes continuously decline, where about 90% of these primordial follicles that were present at birth are going to be lost due to apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And that again happens between birth and early adulthood. Now those remaining 10%, that's what she'll be living with for the rest of her life, and those are the ones that are going to mature and become eggs. Again, not all of them. It's each month, several of them are going to try to mature. Only one of them actually does. Now, the process of oogenesis is the scientific term for the process of egg cell formation. It begins at puberty, okay, where these primary oocytes are going to continue and finish up the first meiotic division, making that secondary oocyte in a very small first polar body. Now that secondary oocyte will become the future ovum. That is going to become the mature egg cell that will be ovulated, and it might become fertilized. Okay, the secondary oocyte does not undergo a second meiotic division unless it is fertilized. So in the absence of fertilization, the secondary oocyte does not go through the second meiotic division. Now the polar bodies that come out of oogenesis, all of those are going to degenerate. The only purpose of these polar bodies would be to get rid of the extra unwanted genetic material. So we'll see here the whole process of oogenesis. Remember, this primary oocyte is surrounded with follicular cells, and we call that the primordial follicle. Now that primary oocyte is in the middle of the first meiotic division. Again, this all happens in the fetal development. Now, in the scenario where puberty hits, that primary oocyte will continue and finish off the first meiotic division to make a secondary oocyte in a very small first polar body. Remember, again, the whole aim of these polar bodies would be to get rid of the genetic material. So most of the cytoplasm and the organelles will remain in this secondary oocyte. Now, this secondary oocyte will not go through the second meiotic division unless it is fertilized, and that's why you see that sperm there. Okay, so if fertilization is going to happen, this secondary oocyte will go through the second meiotic division and become fertilized at the same time, where the chromosomes fuse with the chromosomes that are found in the sperm to produce a zygote, and again the second polar body. It is this secondary oocyte that is ovulated. It is surrounded by a whole bunch of cells that we're going to go over when we talk about what the mature Graafian follicle looks like. Now, the whole process of follicle maturation, it takes a very long time to go from a primordial follicle to a mature Graafian follicle. It takes about a year, about 300 days, to go from the primordial follicle that we're born with to a mature Graafian follicle that is going to be eventually ovulated. But the fact that this is continuously happening means that every month there is going to be an egg that is ovulated. Every month, several follicles are stimulated, but only one of them, the dominant follicle, is going to outgrow the others. Now, what happens at puberty, as we know, the hypothalamus will produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to make FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone. So from the name, it is going to stimulate the whole process of follicle maturation. And you will see that with each cycle, some of these primordial follicles are going to mature into a primary follicle. And the way this happens is that the primary oocyte increases in size, so there's no division happening. It just increases in size, starts to be surrounded by more and more follicular cells, and we call that granulosa cells or a granulosa layer, and will be surrounded with a glycoprotein layer for protection, and that is known as the zona pellucida, or the pale zone. That pale zone is between this oocyte and these granulosa cells. Now you can kind of see the stages of follicle maturation, and I added in here where or how long it takes for each of these to happen. So in utero again, you had this primordial follicle, which is the primary oocyte that is stuck in the first meiotic division, surrounded by some follicular cells. Now, during puberty, every month, some of them are going to change into these primary follicles. So now you see the primary oocyte increases in size and is surrounded by more and more follicular cells. And we now we're going to call them granulosa cells. You see it here bigger. Okay, that is known as the pre-antral follicle. The antrum means a cavity, which is this cavity right here. So this is the follicle before it develops that cavity. So again, the primary follicle changes into this pre-antral follicle, which is basically a bigger primary oocyte with lots and lots of cells surrounding them. We'll know the names of these layers later on in this tutorial. This whole process takes about 150 days. Now for this preantral follicle to change into a mature Graafian follicle, that takes another 85 days. In this mature antral follicle, also known as the mature Graafian follicle, you have the space or an antrum that has lots of fluids. You have that secondary oocyte. Okay, so you can see now that the primary oocyte went through that first meiotic division, completed it to make the secondary oocyte, and there's lots and lots of cells surrounding it. And again, we'll talk about the names of those layers. That mature Graafian follicle is going to ovulate. You see here the ovulation process happening. This is what is ovulated, the secondary oocyte surrounded by the zona pellucida and a crown of cells. That crown of cells are known as the corona radiata. And the remaining of the follicle stays in the ovary. Okay, so that egg that is now ovulated is going to remain here in the fallopian tube, while the rest of the Graafian follicle remains in the ovary, and it converts into a body known as the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. This corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone and some estrogens, and it will start preparing the uterus for a possible fertilization. If fertilization does not occur, that corpus luteum dies off and becomes fibrous tissue, and it is known as the corpus albicans, or the white body. So here you can see the whole maturation process, and we'll talk about these different layers, and I actually prefer to go to the image to discuss these different terms. So this is what a mature antral follicle mature Graafian follicle. All of these are the same terms. So here you have your secondary oocyte surrounded by a zone, a pale zone known as the zona pellucida. Then you have a whole bunch of follicular cells that surround this structure as a crown, and it is known as the corona radiata. There's an antrum full of fluid, and then there's all of these cells. So these thicker cells are known as the theca externa on the outside. That is a connective tissue covering, protective of the follicle. And then on the inside, you have theca interna cells, and these cells produce steroids. These steroids will diffuse into the granulosa cells. These granulosa cells have an enzyme known as aromatase enzyme that will convert the steroids into estrogen. Again, when ovulation happens, this part is ovulated while the remaining of the follicle remains in the ovary, and it becomes the corpus luteum. Now, ovulation happens where we ovulate the secondary oocyte, and the secondary oocyte is surrounded by the zona pellucida and some of these follicular cells. Those are expelled into the fallopian tube. Whatever remains in the ovary is now going to be the corpus luteum that secretes mainly progesterone, but some estrogen as well. Now, the next part will discuss the internal organs of the female reproductive system.